we're gonna have the communication of Tomás Ruiz-Rivas, which is director and founder of the Antimuseum for Contemporary Art, activist, writer, and visual artist. You have more elements in the short bio printed on the documentation. So, Tomás, please.
Good. Good evening. Thank you, Fernando, and thank you for the organizers of this meeting. As Fernando says, I am founder and co-director of Antimuseum. This is the former Ojoatómico and all alternative art space in Madrid. And since recently, I am the editor of the Art Institutionalism Research Center. It's an artist collective that research and publish a magazine about art institutionality with a critical point of view, of course. But beyond telling you that, it's very difficult for me to introduce myself. I am an artist, but not a professional one. I can be a curator, but I don't curate anymore. I am a writer, but I don't collaborate with art magazines. I am not a doctor. I don't even have a university degree. I am also an activist, but my activism is only focused on cultural policies. And I have never worked in an institution like a museum, a university, or a private foundation. Maybe that makes me an outsider, and as such, I hope my talk can contribute something new or different to this discussion. To explain my point, I want to start setting out a very general premise about the role of the image in the thought-making process. Images are produced by the memory, unconsciously, and projected into our conscience. Then, when we become aware of this image, we begin to think, to have ideas, to verbalize. And this is a process related to the subconscious, to the sense, to the fears and desires. It's not necessary to explain that visual art has something to do with image. Also, after Duchamp, it seems to be a function of language and not of revelation, as Solomon Godot says. But as we all know, we specialists in museum theory, curating, and similar disciplines, art is also, and above all, an institution. And institutions have less to do with image and much more with power relations. This agonistic ethos hides inside modern art from its very beginning. Since the organization of the first art exhibition in 1965, and of course since the founding of the first public art museum, the Louvre, in 1793. Modern art has tried to straddle sets of impossible dualities in bourgeois culture: public-private, historical, timeless, handcrafted, industrial, individual, collective, universal, discriminatory, etc. And the task of an institution is not only to create an autonomous sphere where this contradiction seems to evaporate, but to find a balance between the irrationality of artistic practice and the scientific display of the exhibition. Bennett describes the museum as a rational and scientific space of representation, and the exhibition itself came to reinforce a new epistemology. I like to distinguish the art institution from the art institutionality. The first is an abstract idea that includes not only bureaucratic and market structures, but ideologies, its own history, the exhibition as main technology for art socialization, and a dense network of interconnection with other institutions, like the bourgeois subject, an elusive idea of public, the rational scientific knowledge, etc. With the term art institutionality, I refer only to the bureaucratic and market structures, including the academic ones, like this conference. A huge apparatus that makes art possible cancelling at the same time the possibility of new art. As art institutionality grows, a special sphere of experience crystallizes, I am quoting Peter Burger, until a time comes with the historical avant-garde movements when the social subsystem that is art enters the stage of self-criticism, end of quote. Okay, it's okay. This is very interesting because for a century we all know that art is a social system and our focus should be on the social processes that produce meaning, not more on our works, or not only because our works are still alive. However, art criticism, curating, museology, and all kind of art theory are still speaking about our works and usually pointing out the permanent failure of art as a revolutionary force. Why? This is a good question. Art history is based on individual subjects, the artists, and particular objects, the artworks. As much we speak about art movements, which is a simplification, may be useful, but hard to take seriously in the present. And while museums were dealing with institutional critique as the last modernist impulse in an era when that impulse was no longer believed or understood, as Blake Stimson says, many artists had already understood that what matters is not longer what you do, but how, where, when, and with whom you do it. The question is not to put another critical work within the institution, whether museum or the market, because this artwork is predetermined by it. Around 1970 began a paradigm shift in artistic creation, which until very recently has been ignored by the hegemonic art institutionality. I am speaking about the alternative artist scene that blew up in two consecutive waves. The first one at the end of the 60s and early 70s with a space like 112 Green Street, the kitchen of Museu del Barrio in New York, Women's Building in Los Angeles, San Francisco Museum of Conceptual Art, NGVK in Berlin, Zone in Florence, Italy, All Wax in Buffalo, Space Enactment London, etc., etc. And the second one in the 90s with a space like Bank in London or Hoja Atómico in Madrid. In this brave new art world, artists have needed to organize themselves. They needed and still need to create autonomous spaces and to provide mutual support for a collective that has become subaltern after a new division of labor in this hyper-institutionalized system. This is a generation, the 60s generation, that feels that it was no longer possible to do art under the institutionality that exploded in this time. We can find a lot of testimonies by artists in the 60s and 70s expressing their concern with this question. The controversy, for example, between Daniel Buren and Harald Seaman in 1969. Mel Rathsen saying in 1975, consider the following, that administrator, dealist, pundit, etc., who owns seems to be neutral servant of art are now, especially in New York, becoming its masters. Lanka proposing in 1967 that the modern museum should be turned into swimming pools and nightclubs. Or Robert Smithson declaring that cultural confinement takes place when a curator imposes his own limits on an art exhibition rather than ask the artist to set his limits. Artists are expected to fit into fraudulent categories. Museums like asylums and jails have wards and cells, in other words, neutral rooms called galleries, end of quote, etc. It was really a new situation because in 19th and early 20th centuries, salons were always being organized by artists, sometimes with the support of critics, like the Sociedad de Artistas Ibéricos in the 20s in Madrid. But anyway, the role of the other agents was secondary. But this changed. As Jean Fervois explains, the transformation of the role of the curator from that of a caretaker of the museum to that of an author of exhibition has to be understood as the outcome of a general change of the division of labor in the art field during the 60s. The emancipation of the curator As a cultural producer, they turned curator and artists into competitors. End of quote. 50 years later, curators face the same contradiction as post-avant-garde artists. And a big one is the fiction of the invisibility of the museum, that we can see art without seeing the museum. Museums are not invisible, of course. They have huge buildings, armored police, rich patron. Invisible is only the section where power lies. Museums work as disciplinary institutions. As public, you are always watched, observed. The exhibitionary complex, this notion from Tony Bennett, is turned upside down. It's an actual panoptic, and not only for artwork safety, but to guarantee your behavior, a respectful conduct like in a church. The all opposite dualities of 19th century museums have never been solved. Maybe curators have thought that all these contradictions were only artist concerns, but the truth is that, unlike the artists, the new bureaucratic class cannot focus its force in the institution itself, and unlike the artists, it cannot create another kind of spaces, autonomous, ephemeral, moving, non-hierarchical spaces. Why? Because nobody will pay a salary for that. From my point of view, the wide range of experience that we can comprise within the notion of new institutionalism tries to push the institution to alternative arenas. They have taken the experience of self-organized art project to apply it to the art centers at a moment when their social function was questioned. The art market having become more important than museums, and the artists seem to be less and less interested in exhibition. Jonas Ekberg recognizes in an interview that the most important inspiration for institution renovation came from artist initiatives, or, in the same interview, this construction of alternative and mini institutions should rather be seen in continuity with alternative and grassroots methods. However, the consequence of this recognition has not been a far-reaching transformation of art institutions, but an institutionalization of this kind of innovative and critical practice. Some art centers disguise themselves as social centers, focusing on urban gardens, collective knitting, handcrafts, amateur theaters. Others try to legitimize themselves by transferring the lost transcendence of art into politics. In the first case, culture is understood as a leisure activity. Critical and actual political potentiality of art is gone. The latter simply move the question of autonomy from one place to another, leaving art as a servant of politics. It's the case of Borja Villel, first in Marfa and then in Reina Sofia. And naturally, his project has produced professional politicians like Marcelo Esposito, today in the National Parliament, and other closer collaborators, instead of art or artists. Today, new institutionalism is called into question. I think we cannot speak about a collapse, but inconsistent results in the one hand and the 2008 financial crisis on the other hand have caused the cancellation of paradigmatic centers like Museu in Malmö. There is a broad discussion about the effects of this experience on institutional practices, as we can see, for example, in the uncurated magazine 21, titled New Institutionalism, or this conference that in its statement refers directly to new institutionalism, radical museology, and critical museology. But the discussion is always been between curators, between institution people, who usually have never worked outside the institutional umbrella. And as Rachel Mader pointed out in her text for the aforementioned on curating 21, quote, the institution swiftly becomes representative of state political power and superiority, in relation to which the subject must be submissive or obedient, or else insist on a position of refusal and rejection. Critical agency within hegemonical structures is considered nearly impossible, since they are only interested in the extension of their own power. End of quote. Arguments and counter-arguments are all centered around curatorial and managerial issues, but they cannot go out of the frame of the art institutionality, because the players exist only based in institutions, in the real entity of a museum or art center. Something is lacking here, because there is a large universe beyond art centers, cultural policies, and public budgets. We have to dig deeper to understand where the dysfunctions or the renewed institutions lie. Well, modernists understood politics, Modernists understood politics as the destruction of an existing form of power with the goal to establishing a new one. The main way for politics and for art was revolution. Posterior art criticism maintained this position. An art that cannot destroy the art system is a failed art. Avant-garde as failure, and post-avant-garde seem unfeasible in these terms of radical change. In fact, alternative art spaces are often criticized because they have not destroyed the art market or the whole art system. Art theoreticians and historians and some artists linked to this scene, like Julie Ault, expected a revolutionary attitude from this movement of the last third of the 20th century. But most of the experience were not inspired by the revolutionary Marxist tradition. We can identify them rather with an anarchistic ethic. As Jacqueline Cook explains, quote, avant-gardism has tended to be a theoretical discourse about strategy, whereas the alternative has tended to be defined by practitioners as an ethical discourse about practice. The predominance of Marxian critique evident in existing literature and art practice is a problematic, plausible narrative which emphasizes an oppositional, dialectical stance. End of quote. Plausible narrative is here used after Victor Burgin. Okay. Real history, therefore, mutable, heterogeneous, and undetermined, is kept prisoner in its own dungeons, while a more coherent imposter, a more plausible narrative, takes public command and dispenses judgment. End of quote. In her doctoral thesis, Cook analyzes the alternative art scene in London in the 90s and finds a contradiction between academic discourse about avant-garde art and actual art practices. Her conclusions are remarkable. Quote, the quality that I have called complex alternative space involves the use of available methods of critique or the creation of new tactics to enable restless movement or instability, to carry an argument, or to produce friction in circumstances that are not usually seen as changeable. Opportunistic rather than contingent, the aim is not to be a vanguard of opposition, not to change society, but to make space for individual voices, for contrary thoughts, sometimes called an alternative consciousness. What I have found in the research is productive disagreement, is restlessness, an alternative space for thought, of a rejection of questioning of assumptions. It's not oppositional in the sense that it can defeat what it opposes. It's a failure or complicity. The mass of the diverse and contradictory ideas and actions are themselves the complex alternative. This alternative is conscientious. End of quote. One of the goals of alternative projects was to create a context for art, because meaning, value, is not an inherent quality of our work. It's not necessary to go back to Ferdinand de Saussure to explain that. As the situationist artist Asia Jorn poetically expressed, value does not emerge from the work of art, but it's liberated from within the spectator. From this point of view, the institutional renovation is under the pressure of two opposing forces. The museum is an embodiment of the state, and as such, it works as an instrument of power. But contemporary art is understood as a critical practice whose aim is to make visible and to deactivate the means of power disposal. The museum has to be hegemonic and antagonistic at the same time. And of course, that is impossible. And it does not have the ability to create different and simultaneous negotiation positions with the system or to produce the friction and instability that Cook pointed out. The museum cannot create a context for art because it's a context in itself, and a context defined by the exercise of power. When the critical practices developed by the artists in their self-organized experience are co-opted by public institutions, the complex alternative disappears and the image-based practice is replaced by a strategic discourse. Artists themselves are objects of research, management, and curating, but no longer subjects with agency within the art space. It's again the old conflict between theory and practice, text and image, the agonistic ethos of modern art. Short. I think that only Rebecca Gordon-Nesbitt, in her contribution to Ekeberg's New Institutionalism, has asked herself of the role of the artist in museums' transformations. Quote, following a gradual acceptance by artists and audience of artist-led initiatives being absorbed into public institutions during the 90s, organizations like Roseon and Kunstverein München are attempting to reinvent themselves by adopting the methodologies of such initiatives, including a tendency to show process-based work, retaining the ability to react quickly to developments in the art world, and consolidating artist network with the institution at the center. They take the existing institutional framework as the starting point. One of the main pitfalls with this way of working is that artists and their activities are forced into a construct defined by the institutions and generally serves to flatter the institution and disempower the artist, end of quote. And CN saying, to close the gap that persists between artistic and institutional practice, maybe a new model needs to be born from the ground up rather than the top down, which can respond more effectively to the needs of the artist. For me, the question is not how to set up a new institutionalism, but how to de-institutionalize the public resource for art, in which museums are included. And I feel that artists are the wanted guests for this dinner, although we provide and cook the meals. Thank you very much.
So this was Tomás Ruiz-Rivas, and now for the third participant in this session, it's Maria Vlachou, and it's cultural management and communications consultant, and a lot of other things that you can read on the documentation. So Maria, come.
I prefer to stand so that we can see each other. I would like to thank the organizing committee for giving me the opportunity to share my thoughts with colleagues and especially with students. I first came across Elaine Hoyman-Gurion's writings in 2013, and that was a good 20 years after I started my master's course in museum studies. And then I read her book, Civilizing the Museum, in just 2 days. And I remember that while I was reading the book, I kept thinking, how is it possible that I only find out about this woman now? When I started my course in museum studies in 1993, every student was given a free copy of Excellence and Equity. It was a must-read at the time, it was a milestone. And actually, in Elaine's book, Civilizing the Museum, there is a particular article called The Importance of End, a comment on excellence and equity. And in that article, Elaine writes, and I've transcribed it so that you can follow easier, this report made a concerted attempt to accept the two major ideas proposed by factions within the field, equity and excellence, as equal and without priority. For the museum field to go forward, we must do more than make political peace by linking words. We must believe in what we have written, namely that complex organizations must and should espouse the coexistence of more than one primary mission. And then towards the end of the article, Elaine writes, "It seemed to me that the most important word in the title, and perhaps the whole document, was end. It has occurred to me that perhaps my whole career was metaphorically about end." And that touched me deeply, because I think that my greatest ambition as a professional is that one day my whole career will have been a contribution to end. I remembered Elaine's words when last November I came across an article in the Financial Times about the Prado Museum, and I could have not read the article was it not for that quote under the title. "Even if we never opened, we would fulfill an important mission," says director. So that made me open the article. And I came across a quite common view of museums. The role of the museum is grounded in the memory of the nation and of civilization. We have a great responsibility to conserve the past, the history of humanity. At the same time, a museum is a tool for educating society. Conservation, however, always comes first. Even if we never opened the doors of the Prado, we would be fulfilling an important mission, the material and intellectual conservation of our collection. I remember reading that article first thing in the morning, that November morning, and I felt I was in a bad mood for the rest of the day. And the gentleman is not the Prado Museum director anymore. It was planned that he would be leaving in the early 2017, even though I remember a Brazilian colleague reading the news of his leaving the museum in January, asking on Facebook, was he fired because of what he said? And of course, we are very far, I think, from a museum director being reprimanded, much less being fired, because he doesn't seem to realize what a museum is. For more than a century now, and although the ICOM museum definition doesn't put an emphasis on one museum function rather than another, it seems that most museum professionals, including many museum directors, live in a constant dilemma: collections or visitors, objects or people. And this is a false dilemma, in my opinion, and one that has greatly, severely affected the relationship of museums with the wider society. Because if museums were firstly about objects, there could be some kind of research unit, I don't know, but there wouldn't be museums. And if museums were firstly about the people, there could be some kind of amusement park, entertainment unit, but there wouldn't be museums. It's bringing the two together, collections and people, that makes them museums. So no, if the Prado never opened its doors, it wouldn't be fulfilling its mission. It wouldn't be a museum. Crossing the Atlantic, in May 2015, it was announced that the new Brooklyn Museum director would be Anne Pasternak. And she was not a museum person, but for more than 20 years, she had been the executive and artistic director of Creative Time, which is an organization that promotes innovative, site-specific and socially engaged artistic work in the public realm. I remember reading with great interest her first interview for the New York Times, where among other things she said, "I'm excited to build on that ethos of welcome." And what I thought was, she got it, she's got it. She knows who this museum is. And I don't say what this museum is, I say who this museum is. And a couple of months later, in September, I think, I received a newsletter, which was also shared on the Brooklyn Museum's Facebook page, signed by Anne Pasternak, where she shared some of the feedback she got from the people in Brooklyn and the general museum community regarding their expectations of her and the museum. And among that feedback, we have, many of you took this as an opportunity to share your gratitude and memories. Your appreciation that our museum is accessible and welcoming was heard loud and clear. You were also very vocal about your love of our largely overlooked collections. You want us to continue to offer space for the community to discuss and explore art and current issues. And if that was not enough, she asks in the end, tell me, have I missed anything? So what Anne Pasternak managed to do was that she showed people that she was eager to get in touch, to listen, to learn, and also to work on something more, something larger than just her own personal, professional agenda. And I thought, that's great, let's see how she puts this into practice. And it didn't take long, because just 1 month later, the museum came under heavy criticism for renting one of its spaces for a great real estate summit. And it was at a time where people, including artists, critics, and writers in Brooklyn, were witnessing daily displacement and tenant harassment. Artists were losing their studios, etc., etc. So they didn't feel that this kind of event was compatible with the museum's mission, and they made it known. And when I read this, I said, okay, now Anne Pasternak, what are you going to do about this? So some months later, I came across this article in the New York Times. Brooklyn Museum puts artwork from its critics on display. So what the museum director did was that she invited some of the demonstrating artists to present the work in an already planned exhibition that was called Agitprop. And she said in that interview, I'm actively thinking about what might be out there to support affordable housing, live workspaces for artists, and contribute to a kind of community vibrancy. This is not normally a thing that I think most museum directors actively engage in or think about, but because of the conversations I've had with these artists, it is actively in my mind. And to that I would add, this is not something museum directors normally admit. For instance, that they haven't thought of everything, that they don't know everything, that maybe they become aware of other issues and they become more sensitive to other issues by listening to others, and especially that they look for ways that their museums can become part of the discussion. And that brings us to the bubble. Many people inside and outside the UK felt shocked with the result of the Brexit referendum. They felt lost and they couldn't see what their country stood for in that result. People who voted for Brexit, if you followed the news at the time and the kind of talks that went on, were considered stupid, ignorant, and racists. A short time after the referendum, the National Theatre director, Rufus Norris, announced a series of commissions for new plays that would discuss Brexit. And he said, I don't believe 17.5 million people are racists or idiots. I categorically don't. I think we've got to listen. We've got to try to do what little we can to address the complete vote of no confidence in our system. Then a couple of months after this interview, we have the US elections, and even more people feel utterly shocked at the result. Once again, Donald Trump supporters are seen as ignorant, racists, Islamophobics, misogynists, etc. And once again, someone from the cultural field, BBC producer and filmmaker Adam Curtis, takes a different approach, and in an interview regarding his latest film called Hypernormalization, he said this: the astonishing thing in my country after Brexit, and I think probably you're seeing it now after the election of Trump, is that all the metropolitan hipsters looked around at each other and went, excuse the language, fuck, where did these people come from? They didn't even know that Trump supporters and Brexit supporters existed because they were so in their little bubble that they just couldn't see them. What then happened is that they started blaming those people, which I thought was pretty bad. You would hear in bars, God, the really stupid people are in control now. And I just wanted to say, no, hang on, you're stupid, you lost the election. Instead of trying to blame people for voting, they should go out and find out what is really going on, bring it forward, and try and show why people voted like that. And to do that, you have to identify where real power is in our societies. So the question for me is, how is it that we create and how is it that we feed this bubble? And I would say that we do it by assuming the role of gatekeepers and try to control and to condition everyone's experience in the museum. We do it by dialoguing only or mainly with our peers and long-time visitors, and we value their opinion more than anybody else's. We do it by using technical language that most people don't understand, and by focusing on technical subjects that don't mean much to the uninitiated many. We do it by not making newcomers feel welcome and comfortable. We do it by not making an effort to share the knowledge with a wider and more diverse audience. And we do it by not giving people the opportunity and freedom to make their own meaningful connections. Our whole behavior, I believe, everything we communicate and the way we communicate it, makes people perceive museums as an exclusive place for the privileged few. And I wouldn't get fooled with the growing visitor numbers, because should we look at profiles, not much has changed. And that's not a surprise. How can something change if the way we do things hasn't changed? So this is what visitors mostly get in an exhibition currently showing in Lisbon. But it starts much before. It starts much before someone enters the average art museum. From time to time, I open the cultural agenda and I go through the exhibitions, and I confess that rarely a title stands out for me, means something to me. And there can be a lot in a title. A title is a first invitation. A title can show an intention. So in my opinion, there is a complete difference between the following two titles. An exhibition, for instance, called Bruegel Masterpieces of Flemish Art, which is a quite common title, especially the use of the word masterpieces. That means so little to so many. And then the focus on the subject matter, which leaves us thinking, at least me, what does Flemish art mean to most people? And then it's completely different, in my opinion, when the title is Class Distinctions. Dutch painting in the age of Rembrandt and Vermeer. Because I see an intention here, an intention to bring collections and people together. Now, of course, communication works on different platforms and we have different media. So while we may see just a poster in the street or just a title in the cultural agenda, we always have the opportunity to be part of a mailing list and get newsletters with more information, to check the website. Now, more and more, the emails I get have titles like this. I happen to know who Guillermo Calderón is. I don't know how many people in the room know who he is. Except our Argentinian colleague, maybe. The thing is also the adjective chosen might give a feeling of, oh, I should find out who this is because he's been long awaited. And then when I open actually the email, this is how it shows in my inbox. And then I open the email and I just have a reproduction of the poster. And that's a newsletter, but that's not news. And then sometimes this is just that. Sometimes this image takes us as a link to the website. Sometimes there is a text actually coming with the newsletter. And this is just an example. It is a text like this. And I give you a few seconds just to go maybe to the middle of this paragraph. When I get text like this, I go, what? How many specialized books does a normal person have to read in order to understand the simple summary of an exhibition so that they may decide if they go to visit or not? Now, if one is capable of overcoming the feeling of ignorance and inadequateness that this kind of communication provokes and actually goes to the museum, many times, when we're not confronted with the untitled, we get texts like this. Or maybe we get very basic information, really factual information about the object. Or we might even not get real information about the object. And I bring to you a conversation I came across on the Facebook group Museum Text the other day, where a teacher is sharing her experience with visiting with her students a contemporary art museum. And the dialogue between teacher and student went more or less like this. Attention, you cannot step on the metallic square. We can, we're supposed to step on it. No, it's a work of art. How do you know? It hasn't got a black cord around it. There's something written, I can't read, the letter is too small, and by this time the guard is approaching worryingly. I'll step on it, it's not art. It's got a label, it's a museum object. You cannot touch it. Ah, okay, this is not art, whispers the student. If you see the label regarding this object, this artifact, this artwork, was something like this, the usual. And this is what worries me because many people after an experience like this go away thinking, is this art? Or why am I supporting this? Or my 4-year-old could have thought of this, and we cannot afford this. So we keep things to ourselves and we share them with some friends and peers, and there's no intention, no interest, or maybe no capacity to share our knowledge and what we like with other people, with different people. So we give them the idea that we are an intellectual elite and that we are very happy when our peers and friends congratulate us. And the thing is, we are rarely considering the needs of other people who have an equal right of access. They have an equal right of being part, of being challenged, of learning, of thinking. And these people exist. We may prefer to ignore them, but they exist. And they're not necessarily racists or stupids or idiots or misogynists, etc., etc. Now, back in 1853, and I repeat, 1853, British naturalist Edward Forbes said that curators may be prodigies of learning and yet unfit for their posts if they do not know anything about pedagogy, if they are not equipped to teach people who know nothing. And if I may adapt this to our 21st century language, we could say that curators or museum directors may be prodigies of learning and yet unfit for their posts if they don't have the courage and humility to do things differently. If they cannot put their wealth of knowledge into use in order to create connections. If they are not willing to learn from others and to consider other people's concerns. If they're unable to reveal the relevance of the institutions they're heading, if they prefer to live in their comfortable, cozy bubble, if they're not willing to share. Now, I'm not someone who feels particularly attracted to medieval sculpture. I seem that I don't even notice it when I pass next to it, and I don't think like a piece like this in a cathedral would make me look twice. Now, we can imagine that the label for an object like this could be something like that. I went looking for information on Wikipedia. And it could be something like detail of the statue of Uta, Naumburg Cathedral of St. Peter and St. Paul. The sculptures were created in the middle of the 13th century out of Gileburg sandstone. 10 of the figures are merged with the walls, 2 are freestanding. They were originally painted, but those remains of paint visible today date from restoration work in the 16th and 19th centuries. For early Gothic sculptures, these figures are extremely realistic and show a large amount of individual detail. The character of the sculptures and the very presence of figures of lay people in such a prominent place in the church make these unique in 13th century European sculpture. It could be something like this. And we usually love adjectives when we write texts. But then again, when art critic Martin Gayford asked Philip de Montebello, who was for a long time the director of the Metropolitan Museum, Philip, can you think of a single moment, a single experience that might have led you to a life in the arts? De Montebello answered, that's the toughest question, Martin. It was my first love, actually, a woman in a book. She was Marchioness Uta in Naumburg Cathedral, and I loved her as a woman. When I was maybe 15 years old, my father brought home a book called La Voix du Silence by André Malraux. I lived through it, looking at its great four-tone black and white illustrations, and suddenly there was Uta, with her wonderful high collar and her puffed eyelids, as though after a night of lovemaking. At which point I looked again. I looked again at the puffed eyelids, as if after a night of lovemaking. De Montebello made me look again. And I saw the beauty in this piece. It made a connection. And I remember thinking, this is part of the book, it's Rendezvous with Art, it's a series of conversations between the two. And I thought when I read this, would he ever put this on a museum label? So to everything I said before about courage and humility and connections and relevance, allow me to add one more thing. We will be unfit for our posts if we're unable to share our humanity. Because no matter what kind of objects we're taking care of, they are firstly and most of all about human life, about human stories, the stories of common and uncommon people. And this is what can bring us closer together. This is what can help us, I believe, burst the bubble we live in and connect to the real world, to the people around us. I think it is urgent that we do so, and I think that we need a strong and socially engaged leadership to help us do so. Thank you very much.
So now we have some time to questions from the public. Any question from each of the interventions?
Hi, my name is Elena. I'm an art historian. I'm not a curator. And I'm an art historian focused on early modern art. But of course, I'm really curious about what's happening now in museums in the modern and contemporary realm. And I was really interested in your presentation because you just approach an issue that for us art historians is really important at the moment. And you actually ended your presentation with an example. Because if we think about contemporary art, we have, in the art itself, we have more present that relationship between the artist and the public. The public engagement is there very often. Well, it is more appealing. Okay, that will be another discussion. I'm not going to discuss this now. But if we think about early modern painting, medieval sculpture, whatever, how do we do this connection? And we know we live in a digital world now. And I work a lot with digital technologies, so with digital heritage. And what the digital is doing, and everybody knows what the digital is doing today with their lives, is, of course, to not just to allow you to see things differently, but to engage with things differently. So what we're seeing in digital heritage is that we are building new narratives where the public engages with the art itself, but away from but it doesn't interfere with the object in itself, okay? Right. So this is something that was present before the digital just enhanced and opened up an horizon of possibilities. So what I'm trying to say here is how museums, and namely modern and contemporary art museums that are dealing with different kinds of objects of art, are going to deal with this movement, which is more than a movement, is another way of being that attracts, it's more than attracting, I'm sorry, I'm Portuguese, I'm trying to find the right word in English, just draws the people to interact in a way with the object of art that people are actually putting themselves and their experience in the object itself. What's the future for the museum as we know it, and the modern and contemporary museum in this kind of perspective? If you understand what I'm trying to say?
I'm not sure I understand.
I'm sorry,
I'll tell you what I was thinking while you were...
Okay.
And then you tell me if that's an answer or not. And
okay.
I have an 11-year-old who sees things in a completely different way than I used to see things. But he doesn't see them in a lesser way because he uses different media. Mm-hmm. I would say that he's as rich as I was when I was 11 years old. I don't know if your question is really about the media we use to get to the object. Is that it?
It's how this relation, because, sorry, I was trying to do an introduction so you understand where I'm coming from. We are seeing more and more, and now it's something that is separate, is still separate from the traditional museum and the traditional way of dealing with early modern and medieval and classical art. But in a few years, the word digital will just disappear because everything will be like this. What I'm saying is we are able to create sensory experience with these objects of art or past realities that are way beyond what is shown in a museum.
In the museum. Well, the object will always be present, in my opinion, in the museum. And of course now also we have objects that are digital. They are part of museum collections. I think that it has always been like that. The medium could have been different. I remember when I started my master's course, it was the early 90s, how scared museum professionals were of websites. And it was a big threat, and people wouldn't be going to museums anymore because everything was on the website. I don't think one thing substitutes the other. It can enhance the experience, and even in an enhanced experience, people still choose which way they want, what media they want to use to approach things. I think the important thing for museums will be to recognize this plurality of approaches, this plurality of seeing things. I don't mind, personally, if people go to museums and they take photos of everything. You never know what it is that they see when they take the photo. It might be nothing, it might be many things in it. So the museum somehow needs to evolve together with society. And when new means come in, we have to see how we can use them to our benefit in order to enhance the experience and to do it through ways that people feel comfortable with and that allow them to create connections. And I'm saying this and I still don't know if I'm answering your question. I'm sorry.
Yeah, more or less.
I'm sorry.
But that will be for another opportunity.
Okay,
Thank
sorry.
you.
Anyone more with questions? No. So I have a question for Maria too, which is, personally, I don't like to be guided inside the museum. I like to have what we can call kind of sense expectations when we enter an exhibition and see what's happened with that. And even when we talk about educational services and all that things, we are talking about a different kind of bubble that affect in a different way people which want to go into the museum. My question is, the real bubble for now, for us now, for example, I am from Porto, and the Museum of Serralves at the moment had growing prices for the tickets. So the bubble, it's not what the expectations of people are, but the possibility to go to the museum. Já não. Estava ali o Presidente da República, mas já está outra vez. So we have the honor of the visitor of our president, Professor Marcelo Rebelo de Sousa, which is now with us.
President of the Republic. There are many presidents.
President of the Republic. Our president. So my question was, what about this new bubble which affects us much more than this one? What is your opinion?
You're right
about
in
it?
saying that there are all sorts of bubbles. There are different kinds of bubbles. In this case, I wouldn't so much talk about a bubble, but about a barrier. At the same time, and because you mentioned specifically the question of prices, I would answer to you by saying there are many museums that have a free entry and they're empty. Why? So, I think that our main worry should be the content and how relevant and how meaningful and how many connections people can find in museums that may have a meaning for their own lives. People wouldn't mind paying €4 or €6, which is the average price, I think, of national museums.
17 in Israel.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I was talking about national museums. 17 is a lot for the Portuguese context. Museums are a business. Sorry if I shock you with this, but museums are a business. They're handling money. They're offering services. And we need to have a feeling of the context, of the social, political, economic context we live in, so that the prices are the prices people are able or willing to pay for a specific. That's good management, in my opinion. I won't deny that the entry fee can be a barrier for many people, but I wouldn't say it's the first barrier. Okay. People will still go. In Greece, we were talking about Greece this morning, and we were talking about the crisis. In 2012, Red Hot Chili Peppers went to give a concert in Greece after a very long time. There were huge queues to buy the tickets. Why? Because people thought it was something they couldn't miss. It was an experience that they would have at that moment, and nobody knew when Red Hot Chili Peppers would be back in Greece. And they thought, that's an investment I should make. That's something that means something to me and I cannot lose. When are people going to say this about museums?
It's different things. So, I don't know if we have more time. Yeah? Okay. So, thank you very much for listening us, and a break. How many time? 30 minutes of coffee break. So, at 4:30, we are here again. Thank you.